A woman who was expecting the birth of her child any day was attacked in her own apartment in the middle of the night. The police began an investigation and soon very unexpected and alarming facts began to emerge. In the end, they managed to unravel this complicated case, but the outcome turned out to be so shocking that even the detectives were left stunned. Odiana Green was born in 1959 in a Los Angeles suburb called Tan. Her father was a military man and her mother, Dila, worked in a small clothing factory. When Diana was 19, she met a man named Kevin. The girl was in a bar with a friend when a strange man began to pester them, behaving too persistently and refusing to leave. Kevin decided to intervene, and after he drove the man away, Diana approached him and offered to treat him as a thank you. A few days later they went on a date, and their relationship developed rapidly. At that time, Kevin was already married, but he and his wife were in the process of a divorce. Meanwhile, he and Diana began to live together, and she became pregnant. As soon as Kevin finalized his divorce, he married Diana, and they began to wait for the arrival of their daughter. The couple rented an apartment in a small complex. At the time, Kevin was serving in the army at a base just a few minutes away, allowing him to return home every evening. Diana initially worked with her mother in the clothing factory, but in the later stages of her pregnancy, she stayed at home to await the birth of her daughter. By the end of September 1979, Diana's pregnancy had exceeded 9 months, and she was expected to go to the hospital any day. On September 30th, closer to night, she and her husband watched a film, after which a quarrel arose between them. In the last month, they experienced more stress associated with the imminent arrival of a child, leading to frequent verbal altercations. As a result, Kevin decided to drive to a fast food restaurant to clear his head and not continue the argument. About 40 minutes later, a call came in to 911. It was Kevin who told the operator that someone had shot his wife and that she urgently needed an ambulance. A patrol car was passing by their house and the officers quickly arrived on the scene. Entering the apartment, they found Diana lying on the bed in her bedroom, covered in blood that apparently came from her head. She had an injury that resembled a gunshot wound, and the wall behind the bed was also splattered with blood. Although Diana showed signs of life, trying to breathe, the officers began providing first aid while waiting for an ambulance. At that time, they did not yet know what had happened, so they asked Kevin to leave the apartment. Soon doctors arrived and began carrying Diana into the ambulance. At first they also thought she had a gunshot wound, but they quickly realized that this was not the case. The wound looked as if it had been inflicted by some object. Kevin wanted to accompany his wife, but the police did not let him in. They needed to obtain testimony from him and considered all possibilities, including the involvement of her husband. In a state of shock, Kevin had difficulty accepting the officers' words. Despite their prohibition, he tried to get into the ambulance, but the police stopped him. When the car drove away, he began to gradually come to his senses and told the police what had happened that night. Kevin explained that he and his wife had a fight, and that he decided to drive to a fast food restaurant to get burgers and clear his head. When he left the apartment, he realized he had left the keys inside but didn't go back for them. He simply slammed the door and headed to his car. He added that not far from their house he saw a van with an open back door next to which a dark-skinned man was walking. At that time it was around 2 a.m., and this seemed a little strange to him. Kevin arrived at his favorite fast food establishment, but there was a long line, so he went to another location of the same chain a few minutes away. There, he bought several burgers and headed home. All of this took about 40 minutes. When he approached the front door, he found it wide open. He went inside and heard strange sounds that resembled snoring. When he entered the bedroom, he saw Diana covered in blood and trying to breathe, after which he immediately called 911. Questions immediately arose. Firstly, the fact that Kevin decided to go for burgers in the middle of the night seemed strange. Secondly, the trip took him about 40 minutes, which was quite a long time even considering that he went to 2 establishments, all of which were located near his house. However, the officers examined the bag of fast food, which was still warm, and the receipt indicated the address of the restaurant and the time of purchase, confirming his words. As a result, the police released Kevin to go to the hospital after first asking for a sample of his blood. At that time, DNA analysis was not yet in use, but experts could compare various blood traces at the crime scene with Kevin's blood type. When Diana was brought to the hospital, the doctors were convinced that the wound on her head was not a gunshot. Most likely, the criminal used a small but heavy object like a lamp to inflict a series of strong blows. In the hospital, Diana fell into a coma, and the doctors fought for several hours for her life and the life of her unborn daughter. They managed to stabilize Diana's condition and were preparing her for surgery. Meanwhile, investigators asked medical experts to conduct an analysis to determine whether Diana had been subjected to violence. At the time of her discovery, she was lying in a position that immediately raised the officers' suspicions of abuse. Experts soon confirmed their suspicions, finding traces of male semen. However, several problems arose. Firstly, Kevin told the detectives that a few hours before the argument, he and Diana had an intimate relationship. Secondly, there was no DNA analysis available at that time, so even if there was a biological sample from the perpetrator, there was little that could be done with it. Kevin, along with relatives from the armed forces, hoped that Diana and her child would survive this attack. But by morning, heartbreaking news awaited them. One of the monitors recorded a sharp deterioration in the baby's condition. Despite the doctor's efforts, they could not save her. As for Diana, immediately after the death of her child, she underwent surgery, and her condition stabilized. Although she remained in a coma, her chances of survival were now assessed as high. Doctors felt hopeful that, after such an injury, she might eventually return to a full life. Meanwhile, detectives were trying to find the criminal who attacked Diana. After the death of her child, the case was reclassified as a murder, and the local police department devoted all their resources to solving it. Despite Kevin providing them with an alibi, they were in no hurry to eliminate him from the list of suspects. There were many questionable aspects of his story. He had quarreled with his wife just hours before the attack, had left the front door open, and had been absent for too long during what should have been a quick trip to a cafe. Additionally, he allegedly saw a suspicious man near their house in the middle of the night. Yet there was no concrete evidence against Kevin, and the police had another suspect. About a year before these events in the same area, crimes with a similar pattern had begun to occur. In December of the previous year, an unknown assailant entered a young woman's apartment, struck her hard on the head with a wooden block, and subjected her to violence, leading to her death. 4 months later, a similar incident happened to another 21-year-old woman. Someone entered her house, struck her with a piece of wood, and subjected her to violence. The girl did not survive. In July, a different woman was attacked in a similar manner, but managed to survive. However, she spent several weeks in a coma due to her injuries, and her subsequent testimony did not bring detectives any closer to identifying the criminal. In September 1979, less than a month before the attack on Diana, the same thing happened to a 31-year-old woman who died the next day. Her son provided investigators with a description of the assailant, but they still could not identify him. All these crimes had striking similarities to the attack on Diana, leading the police to suspect that a serial killer was on the loose. Given that the criminal committed his attacks over a short period and acted in a relatively small area of the Los Angeles suburbs, detectives understood that he could strike again soon. They decided to turn to the public through the media to warn all women living alone or on the ground floors, as these seemed to be the chosen victims of the alleged serial killer. This warning sparked a wave of panic. Women began to sweep protective measures off store shelves, sign up for self-defense courses, and gather with friends or family in an effort to safeguard themselves from the elusive criminal. Police officers organized patrols to traverse the streets at nightfall. Concurrently, detectives identified everyone who could be connected to these crimes and soon received interesting leads. Several neighbors of the victims reported seeing a suspicious white man with dark curly hair near their homes. Despite the superficial nature of this description, police found several men who fit the profile and checked them out, but this led to no results. A week after the attack on Diana, doctors suddenly informed her relatives that she had finally woken up. However, there was a significant problem. She could not speak, and according to doctors, her brain needed time to recover. At that moment, her cognitive functions were at the level of a 6-year-old child. Around the same time, another attack occurred in Tustin. An unknown criminal entered the apartment of a young woman in her 20s, struck her multiple times with a wooden block, and subjected her to violence, leading to her death. Unfortunately, the police were unable to catch the perpetrator this time. Diana spent several days in the hospital as her mind gradually began to clear. However, she had almost completely lost her memory and could not even recognize her relatives. Doctors informed her family that her memory could return eventually, but cautioned them not to recount any events that had transpired to her, allowing her to remember the incident in her own time. Once the threat to her life had completely passed, Diana was discharged from the hospital and her family took her home. Since Kevin needed to work on a military base to pay the bills, they moved in with Diana's parents, who could care for her around the clock. 2 weeks later, another attack occurred in the city with a similar modus operandi, this time resulting in the death of a 17-year-old girl. Meanwhile, Diana was actively engaged in physical therapy, and her condition was steadily improving. Diana gradually improved. She still could not speak or remember what had happened to her, but 6 weeks after the attack, everything suddenly changed during a physiotherapist's appointment. The doctor began talking about the attack and asked if she remembered who had done it. To the surprise of the doctor, Diana suddenly nodded and pointed to her wedding ring. When her mother arrived to pick her up, the doctor informed her about this, and her mother asked, "Were you attacked by Ken?" Diana nodded immediately. Following this, her mother took her to the police station, where she recounted everything to the chief detective. He asked Diana a few more questions, and she confirmed that she suddenly remembered the moment of the attack, identifying her husband as the criminal. This revelation radically changed the course of the entire case. The detective and his team were almost certain that Diana had been attacked by the same serial criminal responsible for other similar attacks. However, several questions arose. Could Kevin be the same serial killer? Witnesses had described a man with dark hair who lived in the same area where the attacks occurred, fitting Kevin's description. Alternatively, could Kevin have tried to get rid of his wife and disguise himself as an active killer? Given that the actions of the serial criminal were consistent, this would not require much effort. The detective understood that if he arrested Kevin now, his involvement in other crimes might never be proven, and Kevin could escape as soon as he realized he had been identified. The detective made a difficult decision. He asked Diana and her mother to continue pretending that she still didn't remember anything. Returning home to Kevin was obviously a significant challenge for them, but they agreed. Investigators set up surveillance to closely monitor his actions, hoping to link him to other attacks. The police also contacted Kevin's friends and colleagues to gather more details. Almost immediately, they discovered something interesting about the suspect. Those who knew him well reported that his relationship with Diana was very tense. The couple fought frequently, as confirmed by neighbors who often heard their arguments. Friends noted that Kevin frequently complained about Diana's refusal to engage with him intimately during the last months of her pregnancy, although Kevin himself described their sexual relationship as almost ideal. In addition, detectives found no additional incriminating information. Kevin behaved quite normally, going to work and returning home without stopping anywhere else. Soon, however, the laboratory delivered an interesting discovery. In addition to the DNA of the criminal found under Diana's nails, particles of skin with blood were identified. Specialists determined the blood type of the attacker and matched it with Kevin's blood type, confirming it was the same. With this information, detectives formed the most likely chronology of events. As we recall, Kevin had actually purchased burgers at a cafe several kilometers from their home, with receipts and the cashier's testimony supporting his alibi. Investigators concluded that he could have attacked Diana before leaving the house immediately heading to the cafe to establish his alibi. This would also explain why his trip took as long as 40 minutes. He could have inflated this time to include the moment of the attack. In his account of their intimate relationship, Kevin stated that they had been intimate several hours before the incident. Yet he frequently complained to friends that Diana had refused intimacy for several months. Given that the woman was subjected to violence, detectives believed that this was the trigger for her remembering the moment of the attack. Additionally, her mother confirmed that they could no longer pretend and live under the same roof as Kevin. Consequently, the detectives decided to arrest him and bring the case to court. Kevin was taken into custody while he was in a store, ensuring the safety of Diana and her family at home. Preparation for the trial took 10 months, during which Diana's physical condition gradually improved. She was able to speak again, albeit with some difficulty. She also underwent examinations by several specialists who unanimously concluded that her mental faculties had sufficiently recovered, making her a reliable witness. At the trial, Diana testified, confirming that the man who attacked her was Kevin. The defense insisted on his innocence, trying to use the fast food alibi. However, against the victim's testimony, this was insufficient. In November 1980, Kevin was found guilty of murdering their child and assaulting his wife. Kevin was sentenced anywhere from 15 years to life in prison. Interestingly, before his arrest, detectives noticed 2 similar crimes in their district, but both victims survived and could not identify their attacker. As a result, the identity of the perpetrator remained a mystery. However, after Kevin's arrest, the attack suddenly stopped. Prior to this, the criminal had been committing these crimes quite frequently, sometimes several times a week. In the years following the verdict, Diana filed for divorce and Kevin did not respond. Meanwhile, she worked on restoring her health after the injuries she sustained. Although her brain function was nearly back to normal, she faced lasting issues. Partial hearing and vision loss made speaking difficult. Kevin continued to insist on his innocence throughout his time in prison, which was fraught with tension. Other inmates attacked him repeatedly for allegedly killing a child, leading to multiple hospitalizations. When Kevin applied for early release, his requests were consistently denied. The main reason was that he never admitted guilt, which the parole board interpreted as a lack of remorse. As DNA analysis became more prevalent in forensic science, Kevin sought to have existing samples retested against his DNA, but this was denied due to funding constraints. This situation persisted until 1996, when the police department resumed investigating a series of attacks in Thane and the surrounding areas. During this time, semen samples were stored in labs from victims after the attacks, providing detectives with the opportunity to determine whether a single person was behind these crimes and to establish the criminal's identity. Initially, detectives continued to consider Kevin as the most likely suspect. However, an unexpected twist arose when the DNA profile of the criminal was matched against samples in the database. All samples pointed to another man, Gerrard Parker, who had been arrested the same year as Kevin for the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. At that time, detectives did not connect his crime with the series of attacks, as they involved different methods. All the victims had been attacked late at night in their apartments, whereas Parker had kidnapped a girl off the street. Parker was scheduled for release just days after investigators matched his DNA to all the unsolved cases, including the attack on Diana. Although this crime was deemed solved, detectives suspected it might be connected to other similar cases, leading them to reconsider Kevin's involvement. They were left with one question: was Kevin truly the attacker of his wife? Notably, during the time of the attacks, Parker served at the same military base as Kevin and owned a dark van. On the first day of the investigation, Kevin had told the police he saw a man near their house walking by a dark van. This prompted detectives to think Parker might be responsible for the attack on Diana. The local prosecutor visited Kevin in prison to discuss the progress of the investigation and requested a direct DNA sample from him for analysis. Kevin, who had been seeking this opportunity for years, agreed. While the analysis was being conducted, detectives interviewed Parker in prison. Although he had not yet been charged with the series of attacks, the police wanted to see if he would confess. Initially, Parker denied involvement in any of the crimes. However, after detectives discussed the attack on Diana, they found something interesting in Parker's case. Following his arrest for the attack on the girl, he had claimed that serving in the army was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Detectives decided to leverage this by appealing to his loyalty to the military. Under pressure, Parker eventually admitted that another man was imprisoned for a murder he committed. Parker confessed that he had come to Kevin and Diana's house that night in his van, intending to scout for a victim by looking into the windows. Hearing screams from their house, he waited by the door for several minutes before entering, where he attacked Diana. He claimed he did not know Kevin personally, as they were involved in different activities at the base. Parker also confessed to all other crimes, admitting they were not fatal. Police gathered confessions and DNA evidence that unequivocally pointed to Parker's involvement and Kevin's innocence. The prosecutor promised to expedite the process to overturn Kevin's sentence, and a few days later, Kevin was released after spending 16 years in prison. This turn of events caused significant public outcry, not only because an innocent man had spent nearly half his life imprisoned for someone else's crime, but also due to the lengthy time it took to find the actual serial killer. Upon his release, California agreed to pay Kevin $10,000 in compensation, which was minimal compared to what he had endured. A few years later, he received additional compensation of $100,000 for each day spent in prison, totaling $620,000. However, the story didn't end there. Despite Kevin's exoneration, Diana refused to believe in his innocence, insisting that he was the only one who attacked her. After biological material from her body matched Parker's DNA, Diana proposed a new theory. She claimed that Kevin attacked her that night and then left, allowing Parker to enter and do the same. Parker insisted that when he entered the apartment, Diana was lying on the bed without visible injuries, and he claimed he was the one who struck her on the head. Diana's family suggested another theory, that Kevin might have asked Parker to commit the crime, which could explain why he left the door open that night. However, Parker maintained that he and Kevin did not know each other, as many soldiers served at the military base without ever meeting. Furthermore, this theory would imply that Kevin had to know Parker was the serial killer to request such a thing. Kevin adamantly denied any connection to Parker, insisting he would never have harmed Diana, especially their daughter. He explained that he did not lock the door simply because he didn't want to go back for the forgotten keys after arguing with Diana. He added that he would always blame himself for that decision. To this day, Diana insists on her version of events, which may be explained by the trauma she suffered during the attack. Her injuries significantly affected her consciousness. After emerging from a coma, doctors warned her family not to remind her of the events, as her brain could accept any information as truth, leading her to believe such memories were accurate. Even 16 years after the incident, when Kevin was released, Diana continued to struggle with serious issues, such as difficulty understanding fast speech, indicative of the lasting effects of her injuries. This trauma may have contributed to her conviction that Kevin was involved. As for Parker, in 1999, he was sentenced to death. However, this sentence was never carried out. After many years on death row, California instituted a moratorium on executions. Thank you for watching.